In this video, we are going to discuss 8 segregation housing laws that directly or indirectly contributed to the wealth gap in America. Sort of like how banks provided misinformation to African American families to discourage them from buying homes. What up, y'all? My name is Romany Malco. I am the founder of the PEP, the People's Empowerment Platform, and you are watching another episode of Citing Sources. Today we're going to look at how housing segregation laws inadvertently contributed to widening the wealth gap in America today. Know that owning a home and rental properties over time contributes to wealth. Families transfer incomes earned in the past through savings and investment to meet expenses occurred in the future. Look at the Rockefeller dynasty and the Walton Walmart, accumulating wealth since before the 21st century. I personally have friends whose parents were able to leverage home ownership as a means of paying off their child's tuition. Speaking from personal experience, wealth is not just about having money, it's also about having resources. It's about access. These are also very important assets that can be passed along for generations. However, most African Americans were denied this wealth through a series of housing laws that restricted them from becoming homeowners, thus cutting off earnings and opportunities for their generations. Here are 8 of those laws that influenced the wealth gap, particularly between African Americans and their white counterparts. In the event that this video is taken down, please request an invite to petrequest.com. This way I can provide you with a downloadable link so that you can download the video onto your phone, share it with your friends, and upload it to any platform you choose. At number 8, we have the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act of 1975. Back when Soul Train was popping, this act was intended to prevent racism typically associated with lending. Although it meant well, it didn't do much. After a handful of African Americans managed to collect loans, real estate agents proceeded to make it extremely difficult for African Americans to obtain high-value homes. Notice I use the term handful of African Americans. I will explain this later in the video. Let's first look into how these agents made it difficult for African Americans to buy homes. Real estate agents would show the European Americans high-value homes while directing African Americans to low-value homes. And you might say, oh, that was 1975. However, a case study carried out in 2012 by the Urban Institute showed that similar tactics were still being used. The handful of African Americans who managed to acquire a loan were still steered towards purchasing low-value properties, thus accumulating poor value assets to build wealth, unlike their white counterparts. That one factor made the median white Americans 12 times richer than their black counterparts today. Oh hell, I still gotta go through how both banks and even Facebook contributed to ensuring this widening wealth gap. But staying on track, at number 7, we have a law that directly influences the wealth gap. The Homeowner Loan Act of 1933 gave way for the establishment of the Homeowner Loan Corporation, known as HOLC, which set out to refinance mortgages. What these HOLC guys did instead was map out the areas to invest in and map out the areas not to invest in. They labeled some areas red and they labeled some green. You see what I'm getting at? Yes, their maps look like Christmas. No. In the green areas, banks could invest, and home insurance was also available. Mind you, the areas that they marked red, which were dominated by African Americans, were neglected for being perceived as too financially risky and a threat to property value. Only 2% of the allocated $120 billion for refinancing was invested in black communities that year. This is another one of those laws that directly contributed to gaps in wealth. Right, moving along to number 6. Remember how I said a handful of African Americans were granted loans? Yes, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974 that sought to prevent racial discrimination and appeared as though it worked, ended up being that banks just charged 8 times higher interest rates to non-whites. Speaking of other laws that sought to tackle racial discrimination in the housing sector, the Community Reinvestment Act of 1977, which smoothly brings us into number 5. Their goal was to discourage racial discrimination amongst lenders. What ended up happening instead? Banks gave the wrong information to African Americans in an attempt to dissuade them from collecting their loans. You want to hear how Facebook plays a role in all of this? Just hold tight. By the way, if you are enjoying this content, now would be a good time to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. In the event that this video is taken down, you can always request an invite at petrequest.com, and I will provide you with a downloadable link so that you can have the video on your phone and show it to your friends, yada, yada, yada. At numero 4, we had the GI Bill of 1944. This bill was to help veterans after World War II. The GI Bill of Rights, officially known as the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944. This was designed to provide greater opportunities for veterans returning from World War II. It was signed by President Roosevelt on June 22nd of 1944, and it provided federal aid for veterans to adjust to civilian life, particularly in the areas of education, purchasing a home, starting a business. And it really focused on education. It provided books, tuition, supplies, even counseling services. But the kicker was them federal aid home loans with the low money down or no money down. In fact, what am I talking about? I actually have the GI Bill. I've never put it to use, but to my knowledge, my GI Bill allows me to purchase a home with no money down. It also aids in paying for my college tuition should I choose to attend. Can you tell me what military branch I served in? Who said the American Panty Annie Force? That ain't funny.
Show some respect.
Sadly, tons of African American soldiers were just denied usage of the GI Bill because lenders were extremely biased, particularly in the South during that Jim Crow era. But also, if they were able to obtain a loan or were able to get a college education, there was segregation. So even with the paid tuition, you couldn't get into most schools. I think the University of Pennsylvania was like the least discriminatory school at the time. But this also transferred into home ownership as well. So if a black veteran were able to use his GI Bill to obtain a loan and move into a somewhat established neighborhood, white residents would riot. They would protest and riot to demonstrate how unhappy they were with a black family moving into their neighborhood. Now remember, this was 1944, 45, 46. This was back when racism was really bad. I mean, really bad like it is now. I thought that was funny. Tragic, but funny. And yes, once again, the African American soldiers, upon coming home from World War II, were now forced to live in low-income communities, distressed communities, and ghettos. As a person who prides himself on investing in real estate, you've got to understand that home ownership really gives you, or the average American, a shot at wealth. One, because you build equity in that property, you can make loans against that equity to make other investments. You can make loans against that equity to pay off other debt. You can leverage the equity in that home to potentially put your child through college. Based on your property value and home equity, you can establish a line of credit. Property ownership has actually saved my ass in tight situations. So let's say Starbucks opens up on the corner and they're now building the new stadium just a couple miles from your house. Your property value suddenly skyrockets. You've established all this equity in your home. Now would be a good time to take out a line of credit on that equity and do some remodeling to your house to spruce it up and increase the value even more. You can do those things when you're a property owner. Sadly, most African American veterans were denied the opportunity for high value home ownership and the benefits of equity. At number 3, we have the Housing Act of 1937, which was intended to improve the living conditions of disadvantaged and low income Americans. Although Franklin Roosevelt's intentions were sincere, it did little to alleviate the housing conditions for African Americans who were forced to live in the slums. Somehow, European Americans still got a larger portion of the provisions. Unfortunately, according to Roosevelt himself, this act only made the rich richer and the poor poorer. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button, by the way, and request an invite at petrequest.com. At number 2, there was Nixon's Fair Housing Policy of 1971. It tried to promote desegregation by fighting redlining and discrimination. Sadly, the policy was only effective in theory and was never vigorously implemented. This takes us to numero uno, the Fair Housing Act of 1968. This act sought to tackle segregation in rental properties and the sale of homes. However, like that of Nixon's, there was just not enough power to actually enforce the law. Another technique that was used back in the day would be to allow a black family to move into a white community, piss off all the white homeowners, encourage them to sell their homes and get the hell out of there before the neighborhood goes to shit, but then have them all sell their properties to black families for 2, 3, 4 times the value. To this day, realtors still behave like this. Banks still behave like this. Look, even Facebook aided in contributing to this.
What the f?
How, you ask? Well, ProPublica carried out a study on Facebook in 2016. Their investigation revealed that Facebook still provided racial options for sponsored posts. This allowed realtors to choose the race that they wanted to advertise and sell to. This video is probably going to get flagged, but think about that. Facebook did not remove the racial option from their ads until 2019. I haven't even begun to get into how government backed housing segregation. Prime example, all the Chinatowns across the United States of America, they were not by choice. Over 150 years ago, thousands of Chinese immigrants came to the United States of America, predominantly concentrated in the West. They came to partake in the construction of the first transcontinental railroad, as well as partake in the gold rush. But as they started moving into certain areas in search of work, they were confronted by violent xenophobes. Lawmakers did absolutely nothing as angry white mobs would terrorize Chinese communities. They pulled legislation out of their ass to restrict Chinese immigrant employment opportunities, straight up denied them a right to vote or purchase property. They couldn't even move around. They were like restricted in where they could go. And being that there weren't a whole lot of safe options, Chinese families just kept themselves restricted to the ghettos. You know what I'm saying? They chose to live amongst blacks and immigrants as a means of survival. They didn't want none of that angry white mob smoke, but the problem with it is that this also limited the Chinese immigrants' opportunities at quality housing. Chinatowns across America exist to this day due to federal, state, and local policies. Anyway, from the Home Mortgage Act to the Fair Housing Act, you can see how law contributed to the wealth gap in America today. Housing segregation has limited non-whites' access to sufficient health care provisions. It has also limited employment opportunities for non-white and African American citizens. It has limited the non-whites' investment opportunities, and it's cost them a quality education because school funding relies heavily on property tax. Now that you've heard the whole video, do you think there will ever be an end to housing segregation in the United States of America? Please let me know in the comments. My name is Romany Malco. I am the founder of the PEP, the People's Empowerment Platform, and this concludes another episode of Citing Sources.